Hi, it's Mrs. Vance again, and this is the part 3 of the notes for Unit 14, and this part of the unit is going to be about ecology. So we have a number of topics to talk about on ecology. The first one we're going to talk about is about populations. So when we look at an ecosystem, ecosystems have levels of organization just like organisms do. And so we'll start with the individual organism, of course. The individual organism is part of a population. Population is other members of the same species. In this case, it's an elk or a caribou here. There are lots of other kinds of populations that would be in the same thing, but this particular one is showing that one. Then we have a community. A community is all of the living things in that general area that interact with each other, and that would include other kinds of animals as well as the plants. And then the ecosystem involves not only the communities of the organisms, but also the abiotic factors, the landscape, the water features, the mountains, the type of soil, and all those kinds of things. And then finally, the ecosystems, several different kinds of ecosystems together will make up a biome that share some characteristics like the same type of weather, same general kind of location. And then finally, the biosphere, which is the Earth as a whole. So we're going to focus more on we've dealt a lot with individuals so far in this year in biology, and now we're going to talk about populations and communities. So today, the topic is populations. A population, by definition, is a group of individuals of a single species that occupy the same general area and interact with each other. They use the same resources, whatever those happen to be. They eat the same kind of food. They are influenced by the same kind of factors, whether it's the weather or the other parts of the environment. They're likely to interact with each other. And of course, the population as a whole is shaped by evolution. Remember, evolution doesn't occur to individuals. It occurs to populations because of changes, because of ways they deal with the environment they live in. So when we talk about populations, we also have to talk about how the population is arranged in the area that we're talking about. And so to do that, we're talking about population density. That, by definition, that is the number of individuals of a species per unit area or volume. So some species have low population density, like you see the tiger here. You wouldn't see a lot of tigers in the same particular area. They have a relatively large range. And then other kinds of populations, like the corals you see in the bottom picture here, would have a high density population. There's a lot of them in the same general area. So examples of population density would be things like the number of oak trees per square kilometer in a forest, or how many fish of a certain type there are in a particular volume of water. When the populations, within the geographic range of the population, sometimes the local densities may vary greatly. You might have clusters where a lot of them are, and others that are more widely dispersed, and so we'll talk about dispersion as well. Dispersion patterns are how the individuals are spaced, and so there are several different ways individuals in the community, in the population, can be spread out. Sometimes you'll see dispersion patterns that are clumped. In this case, looking at the starfish here in the lower part of the picture, you see that there are clumps that they basically, a lot of them are, several of them are there together, and then it might be a space where you have several different more. So they're unequally distributed, they're grouped in patches, so to speak, and just kind of spread out in a random kind of way. In a uniform pattern, the individuals are most likely interacting in equally spaced or relatively equally spaced in the environment. And so they're going to be spread out relatively evenly there. This population that you see here is people at the beach. And generally speaking, if you've got a bunch of people going to the beach, they try to space themselves in a way so that they're relatively equally spaced. You don't necessarily measure. It just, you don't want to get too much closer to one group than another. And so people have a tendency to generally space themselves out in a relatively uniform pattern. And then we have random patterns of dispersion like you see with wildflowers. So sometimes they're spaced in some kind of unpredictable way. In the case of wildflowers, like the ones it shows here, it's usually because the seeds have been blown by the wind or dispersed in a different way that's just random. There's no real pattern to it. So we will talk about dispersion patterns also. Now, when populations grow, there are two basic patterns of growth. One type is exponential growth. This is when you have population increase under ideal conditions. You've got everything is fine, everything's got plenty of food, plenty of space, you know, everything's fine where you are, and so the population increases up to a point. But eventually there will be some kind of limiting factor that restricts the population growth, whether they run out of space, whether they run out of food. It just depends on what the population is and what the circumstances are that they're in. So exponential growth is just growing in an exponential pattern because everything seems to be fine right now. Logistic growth is when population growth slows down by limiting factors as the population increases. And so what generally happens is the population growth slows down at a point where something is limiting, whether it's space. In the case of, you see the seals here, there's not a lot of space for them in this particular area, or whether it's the amount of food or whatever, you'll see that the population growth kind of slows down. And we call the area the value of the whatever the limiting factor is, that's called the carrying capacity. That's the maximum population size that a particular environment can sustain long term. And so if you generally speaking, populations have a tendency to even out like this unless they've got unlimited resources. So there are various kinds of limiting factors that can limit the population growth. Sometimes some of these things are like you see in the picture here on the right hand side, that population size can be limited by competition, or whether there's a predator after them, there's some kind of natural disaster or something like that. So there are lots of different things that can happen. We clump those into two categories: density-dependent limiting factors and density-independent limiting factors. The density-dependent ones are going to be limited by, or they're dependent on the density of the population. The more dense the population, the more limited it can be in some of those kind of things. So you've got things like competition for food or shelter, nutrients, those kinds of things like that. There also can be some abiotic things like weather that can affect population size because of the density of the population. It just depends on what that particular situation is. Density-independent ones are not related to population density. These are things like fires and storms. Habitat destruction from humans has a big effect on lots of populations these days, and also seasonal changes in the weather. They might cause a group to have to migrate to a different area or something like that. Some populations kind of fluctuate up and down in density with some kind of regularity, and these are generally called boom and bust cycles. So if you see in the picture here and in the graph, this is showing snowshoe hares and lynxes which prey on them. This is in Canada, and if you look at the graph here, it shows the population counts of the snowshoe hares and the lynx over a period of about 100 years. And so you see that the hare population, which is in black, okay, varies quite a bit. Notice how the curve of the lynx population kind of follows the population of the hares. If there's not a lot of, if something happens, for instance, here, there might have been an illness that killed off a lot of the rabbits, that's going to cause the lynx population to decline as well because they won't have enough food. And so some of them will die. There will be fewer kits born. And then once the hare population resurges here, then you'll see a resurgence also in the population of the lynxes. And these kind of follow each other. So predator and prey interactions are very commonly seen in these boom and bust cycles. There could also be a boom and bust cycle related to other kinds of food shortages as well that didn't necessarily have to do with predator-prey interactions.